Welcome to the Top 10 Project. This is a show in which I'll give my top 10 movies from a specific year. But before I do, for each episode I'll watch 5 movies from that year that I've never seen before, and we'll see if any of them make it into my updated top 10. And at the end of the show, I'll use my movie ratings to create a score for that year. And for this first episode, I'm looking at 1976. The first movie I watched for 1976 was Marathon Man, directed by John Schlesinger, and it stars Dustin Hoffman as a history student who gets caught up in a dangerous spy plot involving smuggled diamonds and war criminals. Next up, I watched The Fifth Seal, directed by Zoltan Fabry. It's a Hungarian film set in 1944 about 4 friends and one stranger who debate a hypothetical question in a bar, and the fallout this conversation has on their lives. Then I watched Eaten Alive, directed by Tobe Hooper. It's about a sleazy motel owner and his pet crocodile who seemingly want to kill everyone who comes to visit. Then I watched The Killing of a Chinese Bookie, directed by John Cassavetes. It's about a nightclub owner who must pay off his obscene gambling debt to the mob by murdering one of their enemies. And finally, I watched Mikey and Nicky, directed by Elaine May. It's set over the course of one night as Mikey tries to help his old friend Nicky get out of the city because the mob are after him. Along the way, the two clash and reflect on their turbulent friendship. You know, it is worth saying that this top 10 is my top 10. It is subjective. It is based on taste. Obviously, there are elements of these movies that I do try and critically analyze and think about as I'm watching because I love movies, and some of that will line up with critical consensus, but not all the time. There's some loved movies that I don't feel as much for, and there's some weird movies that I love far too much. But the point of this is that it's my list, so without further ado, let's get into my top 10. Number 10 is The Killing of a Chinese Bookie, directed by John Cassavetes. So yeah, right away, one of the movies I watched for this show has slipped into the top 10. I thought this was a very intimate little drama. It's a thriller as well, because the main character is very much on edge, but I'd only seen one Cassavetes film before this, and I want to say it was called Shadows, and it was one of his earlier films. And it's a director that I'd been meaning to get to for a while and see some of his bigger movies. But I remembered that having a very specific style where he really likes close-ups. And obviously he's an actor as well, Cassavetes. In fact, he was in Mikey and Nicky, one of the other movies I watched. But he loves doing sort of shaky close-ups of the actors' faces. He loves to sort of be really claustrophobic with his shooting style. And it's really distinct, and I kind of, even though I'd only seen one of his movies before, I kind of felt it really early on. But it works in the right context, and I think it works here because it's about this nightclub owner who clearly loves his nightclub. He puts on burlesque shows, but he really is passionate about it, and he wants to put on a proper artful and tasteful show. It's not just about the nudity, it's not just about exciting the men in the audience and things like that. He really cares about it, and you kind of get the feeling that some of this story is a little bit autobiographical, maybe if I'm trying to say that correctly, about Cassavetes talking about making movies. It feels like this guy really cares about his passion and what he does, but the world around him and the money needs and all those things kind of like get in the way of like his passion and what he really cares about. And you see that throughout the movie. But the main thing of it, of course, is he ends up owing a lot of money to the mob, and they ask him to kill someone. The movie builds up to him sort of having to go there, and he kind of does it. He doesn't really want to do it. You know, he's very nervous, clearly, and it's all these like close, quiet close-ups of him making the trip there and like carrying out the plan. And it's very much a character who is in his own bubble, whose world comes crashing down around him, and he's trying to cling on to the life that he's built for himself, but he's got too many things around that life that are impeding on it and coming to put a stop to it. It's a very fascinating little character drama more than anything else, but it is also a good thriller in parts. The build up to him actually going after his target, if you will. There's some really good tense sequences. They actually feel probably more effective because the movie is relatively grounded. The mob or the gangsters in the film feel almost more like accountants than they do like traditional movie mobsters. They feel very they've got forms. Like the first scene we have of them, they're talking about, get him the form for this. He owes us this money, get him that form. I don't typically think of gangsters having forms that they give to people when they owe them money. I think that's like a really interesting feel to the movie because of those elements, because when it does get to the points where there's a tense moment where someone might shoot him or he might shoot someone else, all of a sudden it feels a lot more like scary because the world feels so more normal and mundane up until that point. It's actually quite smart and effective in how it handles those things. So, no, I liked the movie a lot. I thought the performance from the lead actor was also a big part of what makes the movie work. It's very much a character study of one person and his strengths, his faults, what he cares about. He's very much a victim of his own demise in a lot of ways. So that's The Killing of a Chinese Bookie. Number 9 is The Cassandra Crossing, directed by George P. Cosmatos. This is a film set in a train. It is a disaster movie about a viral outbreak that spreads from a lab and ends up on this train full of passengers that's traveling across Europe. And a lot of the movie is, of course, like one of the lead characters who's a doctor on the train trying to deal with the patients and trying to, navigate what's going on here. More interesting part of the film, though, is that as it goes on, it really becomes more about how the military and the powers that be are trying to contain this, not just contain the virus, but contain the story and how they're going to handle it. And while it's just a disaster movie, it ended up having a lot more interesting things to say. And I was very impressed by sort of how much of a darker tone that it started to take as it gets into its last act. It definitely brings up things from the war. It has some direct relations to the Holocaust that it brings up. I also thought that the big climax of the movie, the Cassandra Crossing, is a bridge that they're sort of building up to. When they actually get there, it's a movie that doesn't have a lot of action, I would say, but the action set piece at the end of the movie is surprisingly grim and was kind of shocking. I went into this movie not really thinking much about it or knowing what to expect from it, just thinking, it'll be a disaster movie in a train and they'll have some problems to solve and they'll get out of it. But it had a little bit more to say by the end. It's got an interesting cast. Martin Sheen's in there, Richard Harris, and a few other, recognizable faces from the 70s. It kind of unfolds and becomes something more. Like, it's not exactly what you think it's going to be by the end, and I think it's all the better for it. And I left the movie thinking, you know what? I actually feel like I had a cinematic experience with that, not just because of some spectacle. There's a little bit of spectacle, but the spectacle is very restrained. More because of just the subjects and the themes that it was tackling by the end. It was kind of asking some pretty decently big questions by the end. So yeah, I actually ended up really enjoying The Cassandra Crossing. Number 8 is The Pink Panther Strikes Again, directed by Blake Edwards. I don't think I've got much that I can really say about this other than it's my favorite of the series, and it's the one that I think that's because it's the one that I grew up on more than anything else. The villain's a bit more entertaining. He's very kind of over the top and super evil. There's a lot of good set pieces with Inspector Clouseau trying to get into his castle. There's literally a moat around it. I always remember the third act of this movie, especially. I always had fun set pieces. You go back and watch the first Pink Panther, and it's a very different movie from the rest of the series, and then the series kind of like found its footing and what it really would become with the second movie, A Shot in the Dark, and then you've got a few sequels after that. And for whatever reason, Strikes Again is just the one that kind of stuck with me the most. It's the one that I always found the funniest, and again, it may just because it's the one that I had on tape when I was a kid. Yes, I'm old enough that I had some VHS when I was young. So Peter Sellers as Inspector Clouseau is the highlight. He always is the highlight of these movies. But I do actually think the villain in this is really hilarious. And Clouseau like dressing up in disguises and trying to get to him, pretending to be a dentist, and all the hijinks that come from that are super fun. Just to prove that I actually do like a bit of just lighthearted fun sometimes, The Pink Panther Strikes Again. Number 7 is The Omen, directed by Richard Donner. Of course, most people will know this. This is the film where the child of the main character is the son of the Antichrist, or he's the second coming of the Antichrist, or however you want to phrase it. And over the course of the film, mysterious and dark things happen as a result of his presence, starting with a babysitter who commits suicide at a young age at his birthday party. It's a big scene that everyone remembers, and then it goes from there. I liked this when I first saw it a long time ago, but I watched it again for the first time in a long time a couple of years ago, and was surprised pleasantly of how much it held up. Some of the deaths are really good. There's some good build up to a really gnarly death in the sort of back half of the movie involving a pane of glass. That's all I'm going to say. I don't want to spoil too much. It's got great kills, and it's got a great kind of operatic, chanting score. The music's great. Richard Donner's direction, of course, he would go on to be known for Superman and The Goonies and Lethal Weapon and all these other things. He's not really someone who became known as a horror director, but he very much had his first big movie be a horror movie. Maybe it's because he felt like he did everything he needed to say. Like he got all of his great ideas out in one movie and he moved on to other genres, and I can respect that. But it does have excellent cinematography. The build up to some of the sequences, just the gradual realization from the main character played by Gregory Peck that his son is evil and that he's a danger to his wife who he loves. Honestly, it's shockingly gnarly at times. Like the deaths are great. It's almost like a supernatural slasher movie. I think the last time I watched it, I kind of compared it to Final Destination in a weird way, where, Damien the kid isn't actively going and murdering people himself. That's not what the movie is. The things all just happen kind of supernatural happenstance, right? It's very Final Destination, where just stuff will happen in the environment to kill people. Yeah, it's kind of like a predecessor to that, and it's better than Final Destination. Not to upset Final Destination fans, but I do think it's a better directed movie with a lot more talent and class behind it. If you haven't seen The Omen in a long time, I would recommend it. It really does hold up, so go and check it out. Number 6 is God Told Me To, directed by Larry Cohen. And this is probably going to be one of my more oddball choices that people are going to shake their heads at or just scratch their heads at because they've never heard of it. God Told Me To is a weird cult movie about a... How do I even describe this without spoiling it? Because one of the great things about God Told Me To is that it starts off with just, there's a sniper on a roof who starts shooting civilians, and then he commits suicide. But before he dies, when the detective, the main character of the film, asks him why he did this, he just says, God told me to. And it leads this detective down this path of looking for the culprit behind all of this. And it's a movie, and I've described it this way every time I bring it up, but it's a movie that takes a left turn about every 5 or 10 minutes. But every time it does, it commits 110% to the movie's new direction. And it goes to insane places that involves... I don't want to spoil anything. I feel like it would be a disservice to spoil it. You need to know how crazy this movie is. But I think what's so fascinating about it is that Larry Cohen is actually a really solid director. I've seen a couple of his other films, like Q the Winged Serpent. He's a very talented director who treats what sounds like kind of crazy B-level material with like some actual gravitas with how he shoots these movies. Like they have a really kind of natural feel to it. Again, it's a lot of gritty handheld kind of stuff. They do a lot of shooting on streets where clearly they didn't have permits. You can kind of see people in the background if you look closely, looking over to see what's being filmed. They're just shooting and getting shots where they can. It has that kind of guerrilla, almost documentary feel to it, but the plot is absolutely insane, and just involves the investigation of a man who may or may not be Jesus, and where he may or may not have came from, and there's revelations, no pun intended, along the way that are just wild. And by the time you get to the end, you've been on a ride. But it's actually a very it's a batshit crazy ride, but it's a well-directed batshit crazy ride. And I think the first time I saw this, like probably 15 years ago, I kind of loved it for how crazy it was. And when I did it for the Atomic Cinema Experiment with Tara, and we were sitting talking about it, I was like, I actually genuinely really love this movie. It's kind of stupid and crazy in a lot of ways, but it's genuinely really well done. So I highly recommend giving God Told Me To a chance and see if it's the type of crazy that you can get on board with. It may not be. You might be mad at me for making this recommendation, but I love it. Number 5 is The Fifth Seal, directed by Zoltan Fabri. So this is the second of the 5 that I watched for this, popping up on the list. This is the Hungarian film set in 1944, while Hungary was occupied by the Nazis. And it's a film that I didn't really know what to expect from, other than a group of guys are in a bar discussing things and they start getting philosophical, right? And it starts off feeling a little art house. You know, there's some shots of paintings and stuff as they're talking, but it's not actually that art house. It's not that like pretentious or anything like that. I feel like people might write it off as that if they watch the first few minutes, but as it gets going, it really is just these characters talking about, you know, humanity and ethics and things like that. And it leads to this question that's posed. I won't say what it is, but it leads to this question that's kind of like deciding, like, is it better to be a certain type of person versus another type of person? And the debate gets kind of heated, and they have all these conversations. What's really fascinating about it is that a big chunk of the movie is just set in the bar, but then there is this back chunk of the movie that takes it out of the bar and sort of turns up the drama quite a bit. And I think what I loved about this is that the performances from the actors are great. And obviously, I don't know who any of these actors are. There's a bunch of Hungarian actors from 1976. I don't have a clue who any of these people are. And obviously, you've got this backdrop that the country is currently occupied by the Nazis. And that is relevant. And it's something that sort of comes into it a little bit more as the story goes on. I loved the movie. I ended up really being floored by it because I think the second half pays off everything that's set up in the first half. Everything that's set up in their conversations, every theme that they discuss, all of it comes back in a big way in the second half and leads to some big outcomes. Unsurprisingly, there's obviously a bit of an anti-war sentiment. There's a bit of definitely an anti-Nazi sentiment, unsurprisingly. It's actually really well shot. Like, it's 4:3. And it's mostly in this bar, but it's very, you know, mood lighting, and the camera's kind of always moving. It's always doing something. It's always circling the characters, or it's always adding to it and making it feel like a dynamic scene, despite the fact that it is just a bunch of guys talking at a table. It kind of like teases the scenario that they're in and what the context of the world is, and it reveals more of it as it goes on. So what I love about movies that's just characters talking for a good portion of the movie is that it forces the writing, if it's good enough, it forces it to be creative and inventive and be airtight because they don't have anything to fall back on. And then shockingly, the ending actually has some insane production value. The ending is absolutely phenomenal in what it shows and like what one of the actors is sort of standing around as it's happening. It was kind of jaw-dropping in a lot of ways, especially since it becomes from this time before, you know, effects and CG and things like that. It's just, no, this was really happening, and they got it all on film. No, really, really good stuff. It's obviously, this is maybe one for people who like seeking out Criterion style movies and are into like classic foreign movies and stuff like that. And while they don't always work for me, sometimes they really do. And this, I thought, was an excellent film, and I would recommend it. That was The Fifth Seal. Number 4 is Marathon Man, directed by John Schlesinger. So this is the third movie from the 5 that I watched that's appeared in the top 10. So clearly I liked it a lot. I went in knowing very little about this. To be honest, when I started this movie, I could have believed it was literally about running a marathon. Like I thought he might be a runner. Dustin Hoffman might be training for a run or something, and that's what the movie's about. I did not know it was going to have all this crazy spy stuff with Roy Scheider, who's in it. He's like doing all this stuff that's very kind of, you know, it's all very visual. There's not a lot of dialogue to explain what's going on. And part of the movie is the puzzle of like, what's it actually about? Like the first half of the movie, there's like some seemingly not random, but just different little elements that are teasing what the movie is really going on. And Dustin Hoffman's character is like so separate from all of the other stuff until almost halfway through the movie, where the two plots kind of merge, and then from there he's involved in everything that's happening. And once that hits, it becomes this story of someone who is not built for that world, who has not been prepared for that world, but is suddenly running from really dangerous people and is suddenly in a lot of trouble. Much like the Cassandra Crossing, this also has themes and some commentary that ties back to World War II, the Nazis, and the Holocaust. There's some really direct stuff, actually, that I did not see coming. There's one scene right towards the end that made me yell out, holy shit. It caught me so off guard. It has such a great villain that you're definitely kind of like really rooting against by the end of the story. It has some famous scenes in it. There's some great cinematography of Dustin Hoffman running around New York. I went in not knowing what to expect from it, and it ended up in this great unraveling of what it was. Like, from the get-go, it was just kind of, okay, Dustin Hoffman's this student, he's running every day because that's just what he does, and he's starting to form a relationship with a woman, and then all of a sudden the Roy Scheider plot comes crashing into his life. He's so easy to like and root for because he is just caught up in all of it. This was obviously a very prestigious film that I had just never gotten around to seeing before, and it was on my list for a long time. But there's great moments of tension, just quiet moments where something might be about to happen, where someone might be on the other side of the door, where someone might be down the dark hallway or down the dark street, things like that. So I would recommend it. It was a riveting time that has a bit more to say as well, which is really great. So Marathon Man, really good stuff. Number 3 is Carrie, directed by Brian De Palma. This was one that I saw when I was fairly young and liked a fair bit, but watching it again in the last few years with more grown-up eyes, I suppose, I really came to appreciate Carrie a lot more. I think Brian De Palma as a director, I've definitely fallen in love with his films more in my adulthood. You know, in my sort of mid-20s upwards, I've kind of discovered a lot of his films, things like Body Double and Blowout. He has really a fascinating little catalogue of movies from the 70s and 80s that are these thrillers that are very Hitchcockian. And watching Carrie again with more experienced eyes, I was really impressed with the direction again. Obviously, the performances from Sissy Spacek and some of the other actors in the movie are very good, and it's this story of this teenage girl who's coming of age, maybe a little later than most. You know, the movie famously starts with her getting her first period and all the girls being mean to her, and then from there it's this story of this girl who has telekinetic abilities and the kind of the rage that's going to eventually spill over because of how people treat her. Her mother is this sort of almost evil character who is overly religious, demonizes her daughter for feeling like a normal girl, for being in any way sexualized. And, you know, obviously it's talking about a lot of different things, about the treatment of women and about sexism and standards and all these things. It's also a great thriller and, you know, horror movie. It's this build up to this unleash of her power. It's this tragedy of a story that I think you sympathize with her, you empathize with her, but, you know, the music and the performances, and especially the cinematography, it really is a movie that's only went up in my opinion the more I've seen it. And part of that may just be the themes that it's tackling. Like, it lends itself to watching it as an adult because you're a bit more mature and you can kind of like think about them and approach them in a better way. It kind of just reaffirmed that Brian De Palma, when he was in his prime, is a fantastic director. I think I went from this being like a movie I liked, but, you know, didn't think was anywhere close to my favorite Stephen King adaptation, to being probably neck and neck for the best. Number 2 is Assault on Precinct 13, directed by John Carpenter. Assault on Precinct 13 is a really simple action movie that is about a small town cop who is stuck at the station 13 that is about to be decommissioned, so there's no one else there. They have to take in some prisoners who are transferring, and it just so happens that there's this like awful gang who murders a child nearby, and the parent of this child runs to the police station for protection, and this like gang just basically, it's a siege movie. You know, the gang tries to take over the station to get to this witness, and it's up to our main character and eventually the main character having to work with these prisoners to fend off this awful, huge, expansive gang. But it's a movie with a fantastic soundtrack. It's one of those John Carpenter scores that's really simplistic but really effective. It's got great cinematography. It's got cool characters, memorable villains. But fundamentally, it's this idea of like the cop and the criminal having respect for each other and having to look out for each other. And just this sort of camaraderie that's built over the course of the movie is just fantastic. Siege movies, if they're done, you know, they're not necessarily easy to do, but when they're done well, it's like an easy win. They're just so satisfying to me. Maybe that's, you know, maybe a taste thing, you know, growing up like in action movies or whatever. But this was far from the first Carpenter movie I saw. I saw, you know, so many Carpenter movies before I saw this one, but this quickly shot up to being one of my favorites. I guess I'm talking about the staging, I'm talking about the editing and the pacing of everything. It feels so right in a way that, you know, modern movies, I think action movies tend to be more choppy, they tend to be more quick cuts, it tends to be a lot of all these other things. And yeah, the action sequences themselves are a lot more simplistic in terms of the actual things that are being pulled off, but that's not the strength of the movie. The strength of the movie is the stakes and the fact that I believe these characters are trapped in this station with this force coming for them and they're on their own and they have to work together. Like, I believe so much in the stakes and the characters and what's going on. I'm so invested in the story that it doesn't matter that the action isn't that impressive. but it is still cool when they do things because the characters are cool. I love the original Assault on Precinct 13. I think it's just a classy little action movie that is a great, early film from John Carpenter that just shows a lot of his strengths outside of the horror genre and the other things that he'd go on to do. So I highly recommend Assault on Precinct 13. And number 1 is Taxi Driver, directed by Martin Scorsese. This is probably not a surprising pick. Taxi Driver is a well-praised film. It is held up in a high esteem. It is put on a pedestal by many, and many people will talk about it as if it's Scorsese's best movie. This is actually the only movie out of this top 10 that I rewatched for this list, because I wanted to just double check. I wanted to confirm that I still felt the same way, because I'd only seen it the once, and it had been a good, at least a decade, maybe 15 years since I'd seen this. So I wanted to watch it again and just see if I felt the same way, see if it went down a little bit in my estimation, was it a little bit overrated in my memory, these kind of things, especially since we've seen it be mimicked by other movies, poorly so. And what's so good about Taxi Driver? Obviously, I love that the city feels like a character. Just all the scenes of him driving around in New York at nighttime. It's got this feel to it, this feel that he's out with all the weirdos. All that stuff feels great. What this movie is it's a movie about toxic masculinity long before anyone called it that. At least as far as I know. Maybe people were using that phrase in certain circles before the last couple decades, but that's what this movie is effectively about. It's about this character who wants to be the hero, thinks he's important, thinks he's been alienated by society. He's determined to do something to prove that he is manly. And that's why when he ultimately tries to save this young prostitute played by Jodie Foster, well, technically, she might need saving. He's doing it for all these other reasons. He's doing it for these more self-obsessed reasons. There's nothing heroic about what he does. There's nothing heroic about the actions he takes. He spends a lot of the film wanting to assassinate someone. It's got a really specific mood. The music lends itself to that. But notably, it changes very dramatically for the ending. The last 10 minutes have very different music from the rest of the film. Taxi Driver is a great ahead of its time character study. The sad part of it is that some people misread it, and there's people who kind of actually think Travis Bickle's a hero when they watch the movie, which is kind of weird. It is a movie about a very disturbed individual. Every interaction he has with a woman in this movie is very unhealthy. I kind of wanted to call him an incel at a certain point when I was describing him, because so much of this movie is him having an attraction to this woman and how he goes about talking to her, the things he does with her, how upset he gets when he doesn't necessarily get his way, how he even talks to some other women in the film. There's a scene early on where he talks to the girl out the front of a movie theater, and just the way he talks to her and is kind of pressing her for a date or whatever, you feel kind of uncomfortable, and it's going down this path. And I think this movie is shockingly relevant and ahead of its time, and it's almost a shame that it gets kind of lumped in with other movies that are kind of loved for not necessarily the right reasons. They're kind of inadvertently kind of become a champion of a toxic masculine idea, which is a shame because that's really not what the movie is, and it's not what the movie's saying. It's far more intricate than that, and it's far more thoughtful than that. Revisit Taxi Driver, because it's excellent, and it's saying so much about this main character, and it's saying so much about masculinity. All of the ideas of heroism that Travis ever gets into his head all involve proving how much of a badass and manly he is, and it all involves violence. Those ideas are brought up expertly in the film, and it's well worth revisiting and thinking about it through that lens, because it does a fantastic job with it. So just before I get to giving the year a rating based on my numerical scores, I did ask the audience to send in their top 10s and top 5s of 1976, and maybe we'll see some movies that I haven't seen or didn't mention in my top 10. There's a couple of notable absences of big movies that you probably did notice, and maybe they'll show up here. Number 10 was The Pink Panther Strikes Again, which I'm actually very surprised that the audience oddly agreed with me on that one, but okay. Number 9 was Murder by Death, which I have not seen. I don't even think I've heard of this one, actually, so one to note down for a possible revisit of the year when the time comes. Number 8 was The Man Who Fell to Earth, which I have seen. It was a long time ago. I didn't love the movie. I thought it was kind of weird, and it didn't really stick with me. I didn't feel the need to rewatch it because I didn't think it was going to make my top 10 for the sake of this video. But I have seen it once upon a time, so that's cool. Number 7, and I'm shocked by this, and this maybe shows that this is me asking my audience to vote on this, but number 7 is God Told Me To, which probably means that at least some of the people voting were people who saw the Atomic Cinema Experiment or Streams After Midnight episodes on this movie and found it either because of us, or it's just, or my audience is the same kind of weirdo that I am who likes that movie. Either way, God Told Me To being there is kind of wild, but I love it. Number 6 is All the President's Men, which I have seen. Obviously, it's a very famous movie from the year. I think it's a fine movie, but it's not one that was super exciting to me when I watched it. I thought the performances for the two lead actors is good, but just, a bit dry for my tastes, I would say. Number 5 is Rocky. This is probably the other big movie that was missing from my top 10. It just misses my top 10, this is the thing, that when I watched those 5 movies to see if they made it into my top 10, Rocky was one of the movies that got bumped out because 3 of those 5 ended up into the list. So obviously Rocky's great. It's a good drama, sports drama. Sylvester Stallone's great in it. Not my favorite of the franchise, funnily enough, but it is a really good movie. Number 4, Assault on Precinct 13. I'm kind of delighted. Again, probably because it's my audience that are submitting this, and some of the tastes are naturally going to align with me. Not all of them, but some. Number 3 is The Omen. Number 2 is Taxi Driver, and number 1 is Carrie. So interesting little switcheroo around of some of my entries into the audience vote list, but that is the top 10. So the last thing to do is to give the year a score and put it into the league table, if you will, or the league ranking. So basically, you'll see on the screen right now my scores for all 10 of these movies. And this is a very good year, clearly. The fact that I don't drop below an 8, even at the low end of the top 10, is excellent. The scoring system for this, in case you're wondering, because I actually did test a bunch of different methods, and what I settled on to avoid too many ties and to reward years that had special, above this typical standard of movie, so it is an average of my 10 scores, but it's not just an average. It's an average plus some bonus points. If there's a 10 out of 10 anywhere on the list, that's instantly 3 bonus points, and a 9 or a 9.5 will also add a bonus point as well. So in this case, it gets 3 bonus points for Taxi Driver, and then a bonus point for each of Assault on Precinct 13, Carrie, Marathon Man, and The Fifth Seal. So that's a total of 7 bonus points on top of the average, leading to a score of 15.7. That right now is relatively meaningless because this is the first episode. So I put it into the list. Oh, it's a list of 1. There's nothing to compare it to yet. But I suspect that is a high score. I suspect that many of the years that we look at and I work out my scores from are not going to often be higher than that. And maybe I'll be an idiot. Maybe the very next episode we do will have a higher score, and I'll eat my words. But just knowing some of my other top 10s from other years that aren't as strong, I think that's a pretty good score. The last thing I'll do is I'll tell you what the next year is going to be. And the reason why I'm picking this next year now is so that for the future audience votes, I can just have the link to submit your top 5 or top 10 in the description. So the next year we're going to look at, sometime in about a month or so, is 1999. Why? I just felt like it. I don't want to just stick to one decade. I think this will be far more entertaining if we jump around and do different eras. So we have very different movies month to month we'll have very different movies. So thank you very much for joining me. Thank you for joining me on this first pilot of this new show that is going to be give or take monthly. If it takes a little bit longer to get the episodes out, it's not a big deal, but I will keep doing more of these because I think I like the idea of building a league table of the different years, and more than anything else, it's an excuse to watch more movies from a specific year and fill out previous years, because every year you kind of do it for the current year. You catch up with movies for the Oscars or whatever from the past 12 months. It's kind of nice to have a reason to go back and do that with different years and just expand my movie knowledge a little bit and expand my cinema lexicon. So by all means, if you want to play along and watch some 1999 movies as well for the next episode, that'd be cool. But thank you very much for joining me. You can support all the content over at patreon.com/MailFuzzTV and help keep shows like this coming. And you can also hit me with a super thanks on YouTube if you really like. But even if you don't do any of those, if you like, subscribe, ding the bell for notifications. All these things do help out a bunch. So thank you very much for joining me, and I'll see you next time on the Top 10 Project.